whatever happens with this lawsuit, and we've got to assume at this stage it's probably puts this negotiation into the gutter for a while, it's actually been quite good news for Vietnam. And I think it is underpinned some of the efforts Tô Lâm is undertaking to transform Vietnam and really fulfill Ho Chi Minh's dream of Vietnam being a prosperous, well-educated, healthy, and independent country.
Welcome to the New Asia podcast by Muddy Waters Asia. If you like this episode or want to dig deeper into Muddy Waters New World Order Fund, head to muddywatersasia.com or follow us at Muddy Waters Asia for more.
Hi, welcome to another episode of the New Asia podcast. I'm Carson Block, Chief Investment Officer of Muddy Waters Capital, and I'm joined by our head of Asia, Rob Med. Now, there's an emergency podcast element to what we're about to cover today. The primary topic is a quiet revolution, and we're going to be discussing how the new party secretary Tô Lâm is a transformational leader of Vietnam. He's already implementing a number of changes, both philosophically and substantively. But about 12 hours ago, we got a ruling from the U.S. Court of International Trade that appears to vitiate all of the Trump second-term tariffs, including those on Vietnam. And that creates a really interesting dynamic here in which if you're Vietnam or one of the other nations that was expected to be in the top tier of priorities for the U.S. government with which to conclude trade agreements, things get really interesting. So with that, Rob, what's your perspective from Vietnam?
Wow. This, to quote someone's bad song, this changes everything. I just come back from Latin America where things were slightly different. I'm now staying in probably the nicest hotel in Vietnam, which is the Metropolitan Hanoi. And 50 years ago, I'd been down in the bomb shelter where they still have, sheltering away from what was going on. But notwithstanding that, this is another bombshell coming from America. Vietnam was at the forefront of tariffs. 46% was, well, we're now starting to see was, sort of opening gambit from Trump. But still, it was a bombshell that ricocheted across the whole of Vietnam and undermined, in many ways, or looked to undermine the whole Vietnam story, which was following Japan, Korea, China, et al., get people into manufacturing your country, learn from that, bit of technology transfer, build your economy, wealth, educate, and move your way up the wealth curve. And Vietnam was an outstanding proponent of that, gone from almost nowhere about 8 years ago in terms of export to the US to having, I think, the second largest deficit with the US. We're talking about trade of $100 billion a year. So a lot of cash. Big panic here. When the original tariffs were announced, because that would have really kiboshed the whole model. Now, the flip side of all this, and the way I like to look at it in a positive perspective, is the original tariffs really served to highlight how much that within Vietnam, there were a lot of exports, incredibly low margin. Some would label them as transshipment. We'd probably label them as just low margin. And it was a real wake-up call to senior government that we need to focus on actually what we're exporting and what we're manufacturing. And there's been a lot of meetings between senior businesses here with the senior Politburo going, what are we going to do to deal with this? How do we negotiate? How do we think about our exports going forward? So whatever happens with this lawsuit, and we've got to assume at this stage it's probably kicks negotiation into the gutter for a while, it's actually been quite good news for Vietnam. And I think it is underpinned some of the efforts Tô Lâm is undertaking to transform Vietnam and really fulfill Ho Chi Minh's dream of Vietnam being a prosperous, well-educated, healthy, and independent country. So good news in many ways all round for Vietnam.
So that segues nicely into what is our regularly scheduled programming for this podcast. We were going to discuss this theme that Tô Lâm is leading a quiet revolution in Vietnam. In other words, he's not a caretaker type of leader the way that most leaders end up being, but that he's actually transformational, more on the level of Modi. Is that your take?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I remember the Soviet leaders when I was young. First of all, they lived forever, and then eventually, when they died, they put someone else in who seemed to hang around for a while. Then he'd die, someone else would go in, a few more people would die, and all of a sudden, you run through a whole list of leaders, and they usually ended in EV at the end. But everything else, you really had no idea what had changed. They wasn't helped by the fact it was usually cold and they wore big furry hats. But in Vietnam, no, this is not only is a generational change, there's only one person now, I think that's right, in the Politburo who actually fought in the war. Everybody else is a generation below. Well, I was starting to dig into some of the past, and yes, he does want control over things, and understandably, if you want to change things, you need control. In 2018, he first showed his sort of public chops as a reformer when he slimmed down the police force in the pursuit, I believe, of efficiency and responsibility. And since he's actually taken over in Vietnam, he has one of the reasons why I like the quiet revolution, and in contrast to your beloved leader, who seems to be making a very noisy, and the question is whether it's a revolution or not, but there's certainly a lot of noise. Tô Lâm usually gets agreement with the political party, within the political party, as to what he's going to do, and then announces it reasonably quietly.
All right, so Rob, in what ways, what is Tô Lâm planning that is actually or potentially revolutionary?
I think some of the big changes, just to highlight, he's come out and said free education. He wants people to be a well-educated society. He's talked about increasing the spending on healthcare. That all sounds kind of socialist and okay. But equally, on the other side, for his sort of capitalist credentials, he's turned around and said, look, we have to acknowledge the fact that the private sector is a big employer, it's a big contributor to GDP, and we should raise its standing within the sort of social acceptance of the country. This is a dramatic change from the previous years.
Is there a comparable there to China? Is this the early Deng Xiaoping, it's glory is to get rich, black cat, white cat, doesn't matter? Or is this something that's further or more recent in China's history? Or is there not really an analog in China's modern history to this philosophical change here about private business?
I think Doi Moi here was the sort of opening up that would be similar to the original Chinese opening up. This is something of a divergence from China. And what I mean by that is that China has always said, even when they've said, oh, the private sector's there, we want to have it, they've always suggested that the state sector was going to control key sectors and be first amongst equals. Whereas here, the government is actually turning around and saying, okay, if it's defense or something like that, yeah, clearly it's going to be a state-run business. As to be fair, it is pretty much in quite a lot of Western capitalist countries. But everything else is open for the private sector, and it's going to take time for all these reforms to roll through. But it's a very big change, and I think it's actually quite different to China.
Yeah. No, what you're saying there, I think actually goes to a key point, because when I talk to people here in the West and they know I'm very critical of China, they say, well, this is another communist party. How is Vietnam going to be different from China in terms of the things with China, the issues with China that you, Carson Block, have? And I think that this highlights what I really say, or what I say, which is, look, Vietnam is never going to have the scale of China. So that affects its policymaking thinking quite differently. So in the case of China, why does it have these large state-owned enterprises that crowd out private businesses in the economy? Well, a big part of it is that China, because it has this scale, its government, I would argue, and a lot of people would agree with this, it's kind of like a neo-imperialist mindset. And so they want to have, or, mercantilist mindset. So they want to have these state champion or these national champions that dominate the global industry for strategic reason. Okay, that's not an option for Vietnam, right? They're not going to have national champions that can influence,
Unset standards.
massively. Yeah, right, exactly, and that will have massive impacts on the West the way that China's do. So I think this is an important point as to why, at least from my chair, and it sounds like you agree, sitting in Vietnam, why when Vietnam says, hey, we really actually want to encourage growth of the private sector and decrease our focus on the state-owned enterprise sector, this actually can be the case. It's not an empty promise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this whole setting of standards in industries requires big domestic market share. Many years ago, I used to spend a lot of time in Japan. And one of the interesting things there was that in the days when there was a tripolar economic universe, i.e. Europe, US, and Japan was kind of a third of the economic world. And so therefore it could set its own standards when mobile phones came out in the early days. And it basically banned everybody else from selling phones into Japan. And it stayed that way. Then, of course, what happened was that Eastern Europe opened up, China opened up, and Japan fell from being about a third of the world's economy, consumer economy, to somewhat about 15, 18%. You can no longer set standards, and Japan's fallen by the wayside ever since. Now, with Vietnam, you're the small guy coming into a big world. So what you want is the technology to come here, and you got to make it welcoming to people. And that is what Vietnam is doing. They're not trying to be the behemoth, as you say, not trying to be the bully, they're trying to be open because they realize where they are in the economic ladder. They want to climb up. They don't think they're going to climb up to step 1, 2, or 3, but they think they can get in the top 10, which, with the population and scale over time and decent education and a well-run country, I'm absolutely sure they can get there. It's a very sensible move by the government.
Now, one of the things that Tô Lâm is also doing, maybe it's a misnomer to refer to it as one of the things, but it seems like it's a big philosophical change, is that he's striving to impose a much higher level of efficiency on the government. And there's been a lot of talk about this. What does that mean in practice? And how is that beneficial to the economy, to investments in Vietnam?
Yeah, it's funny. What I would really forget efficiency. What he's actually trying to impose is a level of responsibility. Government jobs are not a comfy sofa that you can sit on for the rest of your life. Government jobs are a privilege, and you are responsible for helping the country develop. One of the big problems we have in Vietnam is the government says we're going to invest X amount of money in infrastructure or education or whatever, and you get to the end of the year and they spend 50, 60, 70% of what was allocated. And already this year we've got a similar-ish problem. Tô Lâm come out and said, right, in the next month or so, I am not only going to publish which department, this particular example is in Ho Chi Minh, not only going to publish which department is responsible for allocating and spending that money, but who are the individuals who are responsible in spending that money. This isn't the sinecure for life that I thought it was and how to have a nice time. And he's been very clever about a few things. So one of the things that earlier this year, anyone's actually been to Vietnam will know, traffic management is an interesting system here. It's the only place in the world where you can be going down a one-way street, there's traffic coming from 3 other different directions. So that makes for sort of novel travel. But what he did earlier this year was Tô Lâm came out and said, right, if you run a red light, you will be fined. And told the police to execute this with a firm hand. Now, first thing was, half the traffic lights didn't work. Okay, and so people started complaining about the fact that traffic lights didn't work. And essentially the government said, hold on, that's not our problem, that's the local government's problem. So now you've got people from the bottom coming up going, well, hold on, say, why are the traffic lights not working? Go and find me the traffic lights work. Now, 2 or 3 months further on, you find that all the traffic lights work and people are now stopping at the traffic lights. I think about when I go to England and see potholes in the road. Well, guess what? If you could find the local council, individuals working for the local council, I suspect potholes would get improved somewhat effectively. And so I think Tô Lam's doing a very good job. And it's early stages, but good job of, making people responsible.
Look, it's one thing though, if we're talking about traffic lights and potholes. I'd say the key question, you can spend money, but can you actually get results? And so it's obviously been a famous example. It took something close to 20 years for Ho Chi Minh City to open up its metro system or open up its first lines in the metro system. So yeah, you could spend money, but can you get results? Does the government or does Vietnam have the capacity, if we're talking about infrastructure spending, to actually put this to work? Have things changed since Vietnam first tried, or Ho Chi Minh City first tried to build that metro?
The short answer is yes. And again, I'll come back with a Western example. A year ago, there was no Terminal 3 Tats on that airport, which is the main airport in Saigon. Literally, it was flat ground. A year later, it's fully operating Vietnam Airlines. It's not absolutely perfect, but it's pretty smart, pretty nice, and it's completely uncrowded, and it's a nice thing to go through. I think how long it would have taken Heathrow to build Terminal 5, it was a lot longer than 12 months. Probably a bit more sophisticated, but it's up and operating. I've been a big cynic, never believing that the new Ho Chi Minh Airport could possibly get operational by the end of this year. And I'm not convinced it's going to be 100% operational, but I certainly think by the middle of next year, it will be largely operational. And that will have taken less than 3 years to build, 3.5 years to build. So the thing about Vietnam is often the planning can take quite a long time, but as soon as they start pouring concrete, it moves really rapidly. Now, again, big thanks to the Trump family, and we'll see whether it comes through. But one of the big problems in Vietnam has always been, oh, well, I want to build a property and it takes years to get the forms filled and this, that, and the other. And then by the time I get the forms filled, I've got to do land clearance and that slows down. Well, Trump's come out, or the Trump family, Trump organization, I should say. And two things. First of all, they've managed to cut a deal with the government to build a golf course and a luxury hotel, and the approvals for that went through very quickly. And I was actually having a discussion at lunchtime today. Someone was making some salacious remarks suggesting that this was remarkably quick and did it break the law? And I was like, well, hold on a second. There's two different things here. One is having a law, and the other is getting the person to sit in his office and stop reading the newspaper and sign the law. And it would appear in this instance that people have addressed the issue with a sense of urgency. And that, again, sets a precedent for every other foreign investor coming in. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to spend good money on infrastructure in Vietnam. We need a lot of infrastructure. And if the progress on that stuff moves rather quicker than it has done in the past, it'll be very good news.
One of the things that you've discussed also, and I hate this comparison, but you talk about how Tô Lâm wants to reform Vietnamese government by slimming it down to make it more efficient, very similar to DOGE. That's the comparison I hate. Explain this. I mean, I'm very skeptical of DOGE, and I can distinguish why this would work in Vietnam from what DOGE has not done here in the U.S. But yeah, talk to us about what's going on, and then we can discuss the DOGE comparison if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big differences here, and people get taken a bit by surprise sometimes, the government here, is that somebody has an idea, it gets discussed within the core people within government. It might take a little while, agreements made, then it gets announced, and then it gets executed. Whereas in the West, somebody has an idea, they talk about it, and then possibly it gets executed, or it dies in the sludge of the blob, as one might call it. Tô Lâm has an interesting situation because although we don't have sort of traditional democratic elections here, there are votes for who's going to lead the party, and these happen typically every 4 to 5 years. And he came in early because the previous general secretary died, And so we have the next vote to essentially reaffirm his seat in January, February next year.
I think it's 20% of the government workforce, right? Is the target reduction?
Absolutely. But those slim downs go all the way up. So you're talking about a reduction in Congress seats as part of the National Congress, and then various people all the way down. But yes, he has turned around and gone, we are going to slim down the number of provinces, and that's not just a geographic thing. For every province, there's a sort of local assembly that oversees stuff. So if you can get rid of 5 of those 6 or how many provinces you can, you get rid of those government seats. He's actually removed, so you have province, you have towns, you have communes, and you have districts. All of those are a layer of bureaucracy. He's getting rid of, I think, the commune level just completely. Now, it doesn't mean everyone's going to get sacked or made redundant, but what it does mean is in terms of people's responsibility, there will be fewer bosses. He has turned around and said this year 100,000 jobs in government will go, with a long-term target of 400,000, which is quite dramatic hacking back. And the same with the police. He's turned around and he's got rid of a layer of police, and all of this. The problem is there's so much red tape here that when you want something approved, you find you've got to go to 5 or 6 different people. Now, you may still need 5 or 6 different signatures, but 2 of them might be the same person.
Yeah, and that highlights why I am bullish on what he's doing here, as opposed to, say, what DOGE is purported to be doing in the US. And that is, so number one, because Vietnam was a command economy and its government apparatus was designed for a command economy, all right, it's easy. Okay, it was like being inefficient was a feature, not a bug. So it was designed to be inefficient. So you can rip out, if you said, hey, the point here is to be efficient, you can rip out a lot of that apparatus and things will actually work better. I used to quip when I lived in China. It's like, you could probably pick up 50 to 100 basis points of GDP growth here if you just laid off about 33% of the government workforce. Because, there was also, there's also a social policy element to it as well, which is social and economic policies like, oh, the government will provide all these jobs. So you have to, ensure that these people get papers put in front of them to sign. And that gets to the main point when I think about government efficiency, which is workflows. And I'll give you a very private sector example to explain what I mean here. But again, this supports why I'm bullish about this in Vietnam. So I had drinks not that long ago with a friend of mine who is pretty high up in the operations side of a major bank. And what he told me was, and this is one of the banks that, had been fined a bunch of times after the financial crisis by the government. The government was treating it like an ATM, basically. And so, what he said was that, of course, they hired, the massive hiring in compliance staff and, and related. And he said that, they realized at one point that this was, that this was throwing a lot of sand in the gears, like having all of these compliance people and processes, but they also feel handcuffed in the sense that they can't lay them off because the headline of large bank lays off, blah number of compliance people would be a really bad headline. He's like, so we just had to redesign, project he was working on was to redesign workflows to circumvent them. So that's the thing. You could, in Vietnam, even without getting rid of these people, you could just redesign workflows to cut them out. But if you're going to redesign the workflows, which it sounds like that's what Tô Lâm is pushing, is effectively redesigning workflows, well, then if these people, we don't need their signatures on stuff, then you can get rid of them and it makes things better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, as I look at this, he's set new rules about real estate, which cuts down the number of decisions people need to get approval on. He's been through with FDI. He's said, look, where for industrial parks, local provincial authorities can make decisions rather than always going back to the central government. Again, the stock market, he's trying to take out rules in the stock market. not rules that protect investors, but rules that sort of archaic rules that have been around for a while. So removing pre-funding and consular notarization, just a few things like this that just make it more difficult. Again, with the government, he's talking about accelerating digitization to make it faster, quicker. I went to a meeting this
is
morning.
India. Well, is India a blueprint there? Is that what he's looking to do, or is it too early to say?
Too early to say. I rather hope he's going for the Estonia, we're all digitized model rather than the India, we shuffle paper model. But, that's possibly too harsh on India. I don't know yet. Again, with, private businesses, he's talking around providing interest rate subsidies from the banks and stuff like that, where it's sort of pre-approved. Again, reduce the number of signatures, get people's mindset changed. So absolutely, I think you're right. I think whether it's intentionally how he's doing it, I don't know, but a lot of what he's doing is to try and minimize the work and interference by central government.
All right. So with the quiet revolution, then what we've covered so far is we've covered accountability for making decisions, accountability for spending government infrastructure money, pushing the private sector in a substantive way, and while de-emphasizing the SOE sector. Also, as you mentioned, the reforms that you think are going to be brought on by the fact that Trump initially announced these very high tariffs, with a focus on ensuring that Vietnam's export sector is really doing higher value added work as opposed to transshipment. Is there anything else that you think is important to cover here?
In the sort of summary side, let's not forget that whole personal responsibility thing, and that, the government came out recently and the finance minister acknowledged that it was the state was responsible for difficulties in some of the power station projects. Now that, again, that's transformational. No one ever suggested the state was responsible for any delays ever before. It's the state turning around and saying, right, individuals within the government are responsible for stuff and they have to answer to it. And if you're not prepared to do that, hop on the bus and get out. That, I think, is one of the biggest things that make a difference. They are also, obviously, they've massively, since Tô Lâm, to be fair, since the year before Tô Lâm got in power, but since, they worked really hard on diplomatic relations. He got on and talked to Trump pretty much immediately after he took office, and certainly after the tariffs. They've widened their trade relationships around the world. They're working hard on the visa policies, changing perception, social welfare, bureaucracy. There's just a lot going on, which doesn't really seem to be attracting the attention of the rest of the world, which is kind of good news for us in the short term, in terms of it gives us time to really dig into our companies and understand them. But I think in 2 or 3 years' time, people even look back and go, how the hell did we miss that?
Hopefully, there will be enough people who are joining us in putting money into Vietnam and will not miss this and actually capitalize on this. So it's a quiet revolution. It would be nice. Hopefully we're making a little bit less quiet with this podcast and other outreach efforts. But I'm really bullish on the situation. The recent decision, obviously, by the U.S. Court of International Trade is potentially even more bullish. We'll see how that plays out. But Tô Lâm sounds like a transformational leader, and very happy that we're there invested at the time that he ascended to leadership. So thanks for joining me, Rob. Really interesting, and see you next time.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Asia Podcast by Muddy Waters. If you like this episode or want to dig deeper into Muddy Waters' New World Order Fund, head to muddywatersasia.com or follow us at Muddy Waters Asia for more. Don't forget to like and subscribe.